some of the culture we built at Unchained, I think what is unique about building a company in Bitcoin. This is an example of kind of what I feel like the emotional experience is building a Bitcoin company. You have already the highs and lows of any typical startup. The same day you got a term sheet for your next round of funding, your best employee quits, or sign a new customer at the same time one of your best customers leaves. So it's already its own roller coaster, and then Bitcoin kind of adds something to that. Bitcoin has its own cycles, with its own ups and downs that I find amplify the peaks and can make those valleys also very low. So I'm going to talk about a couple key moments for Unchained, especially those kind of low moments where what we found is just really important to have a set of values that can kind of really sustain you through those time periods. I'm going to kind of talk about this in the context of a map. So you need a map and a compass to know where you are, where we're going. And so there's this way I've looked at the eras of Bitcoin, something like a frontier era, the earliest days from 2009, 2016. Then you had the mainstream era, 2017 to 23. And then the integration era we're in, really with the dawn of ETFs, and as we're kind of reconciling with more traditional institutions. I think these also parallel in the startup journey, your frontier early stage days, where a lot of people are big in the PlebLab context, and you have growth and breakout success, hopefully, as you have product market fit, and then lasting success. So within each of those eras, I think there's just some similarities or ways that, again, building in Bitcoin, I feel like you're kind of experiencing the same journey Bitcoin goes through, but in the micro context of your startup. So the frontier era, I thought it was kind of funny to play. There was some headlines, like what would be a headline in like an 1800s frontier context for Bitcoin? Lo, a new money emerges from the digital plains, untamed and free from the shackles of central bankers. Yeah, this is the draw for all of us. This is kind of what brought us in. There's the core values, non-central bank issued money, self-custody. And that was really there in those early days. And a lot of the more enduring companies and products that come out of the frontier era, things like Ledger, Trezor, a lot of exchanges as well. But the many ones that endured or lasted the most, those set the trail, those set the grooves or the trails that we kind of all get to build on. Unchained is the very fortunate building on a lot of great things, products like Ledgers and Trezors that form the self-custom backbone for our products. And then same thing, there's that draw for early employees or early stage people that want to come in because they share those values. Pioneers stake their claim, founders brave uncertainty with nothing but conviction and rocks. So this is kind of that early stage vibe for a company. Then, crypto, Bitcoin, it kind of went through its mainstream era. Crypto fever sweeps nation. Wall Street bulldozes into Bitcoin as values take back seat. So this is kind of the tension for an industry, tension for a startup. As you start to get that breakout success, how do you operationalize that? How do you, it's the other kind of headline, it highlights this. Within the startup, you start becoming more metrics driven. You're not necessarily values or mission driven. You're trying to hit KPIs. You're trying to build processes, build structure so you could scale. It's important. It's part of like the hype cycle, the kind of growing up for the industry and startup. But you do risk losing something. You saw in the industry, whether it's BlockFi or FTX, the other firms, they weren't really built on the same values, and they did front ultimate. Now we're in the integration era. I thought maybe a quote or a calling to MLK Jr. or something there. I have a dream that one day the sons of cypherpunks and the sons of bankers will be able to break bread together at the table of SIA. I think that I think that's something like the era we are in Bitcoin. Again, I mentioned ETFs, the governmental institutions, all of us having to reconcile the traditional financial world and Bitcoin, and you kind of have to have a merging of values or uniting of ideals. You don't want to lose those original ideals, those things that got you there from your founding principles. So that's kind of what I'm going to talk about in some of these next slides. Is sort of what were some of those early founding principles for Unchained? How were those challenged at different moments? And how are we kind of working to reunite that to our operational brethren in terms of the company and the kind of our visionary founder folks that were part of our early beginnings. So Unchained has really had something like these values, I want to say, from day one. It wasn't actually really expressed, or it didn't start in the first few years actually calling these our values. It actually took a few years to kind of discover or mine these out of the behaviors and ways we lived and operated at Unchained. So the three values are: Bitcoin is our common purpose, we celebrate extreme ownership, and we have a low time preference. There's ways to, sometimes I feel like values of a company, they get described as like, we value integrity, you value honesty, you value client service, or these things that I really struggle with those kinds of words because I think those often mean something different to different people, and they're vague, or like just when they're words on a website like that, they don't really mean anything. I think a lot of us just brush over those types of things. So In another context, these might be called principles. I didn't really bother with too much because these actually feel real. So are things kind of evidence from like showcase where they're happening or not in a company, and that's something we'll talk about. The Bitcoin being our common purpose, we commit to building something great together that serves the Bitcoin community and empowers true ownership. So something probably inarguable at this point, like the best companies or successful companies are mission driven. So it's kind of based into our values, a core mission driven idea from the very beginning. And there's a tension there to kind of talk about as you work in Bitcoin, you work on recruiting people from Bitcoin, that sometimes you can overcorrect and hire for passion, but not for skills. So we've kind of had this back and forth over our history of having to learn. You can't just hire that person because they are super popular on Bitcoin Twitter, or they really are super passionate, but then they end up not having the skills. That's one failure mode. The other failure mode is somebody who has the skills, has done maybe that bowl at a different company before, but they never really pick up the Bitcoin ethos. They don't quite like adapt to the mission. So those people can burn out just as well inside of a company too. So you have to get both. You want people with the skills, and then hopefully they have the Bitcoin passion. And then also to scale, because aren't really quote enough Bitcoiners yet that have done all the jobs and need to grow as a company. And so you have to find a way to institutionalize or bring in people that didn't know about Bitcoin before they really start. And how we've addressed that or unpacking this as a value is to say, what are the values that make a good Bitcoiner? You're probably open-minded, you're curious, you're truth-seeking, maybe you're skeptical, you like to reason things out for yourself. So you kind of look for those underlying pieces, those underlying things that are characteristic of our own journeys to Bitcoiners, and then try to find the people that exemplify those on the way in, and then you can make Bitcoiners out of them eventually. So some of the ways this kind of gets realized, this one, I kind of wanted to leave, or at least narrate a story about fundraising. For me, fundraising was one of the bigger challenges personally from running a startup. We've raised a lot of money now at Unchained when I want to look back at it. And part of how I went about it very wrong early on was I treated it as a problem of trying to be perfect. So I wanted to have the perfect company, the perfect pitch. I wanted to deliver the perfect presentation. And what you learn over time is that no person's perfect is the same as another person. I asked everyone in this room what their idea of perfection is. I get as many answers as there are people here. So it's also an impossibility that you can't quite reach. It's said the thing to optimize for in fundraising is connection. So connection with the investor. And the great thing that opens up, or why that's really generative and powerful, is because we can connect with somebody on almost anything, whether you have kids, whether you have a dog, whether, what you did that day, what you're doing that weekend, but also especially Bitcoin. When Unchained was getting started in 2016 and 17, there weren't any Bitcoin-focused venture funds. There wasn't any early-stage investors doing that. So you all have great fortune. I feel like there's a version for me back in my day, we had to go uphill both ways, to raise a seed round. But it's something that's want to highlight. And this is a real spreadsheet is from my journey. Earlier versions of managing a fundraising process look like investors by stage, and you try to get to an intro and then the initial pitch and a partner meeting, things like that, to what I evolved to. And this is from 2022. The most important column is the last column, relationship score. And that is basically a subjective answer to how close do I feel to that investor right now? And that feeling is like, what could I talk to them? Could I call them and talk to them about almost anything right now? And that's a feeling of like, a sibling, or not always sibling, but somebody that you can open up with. And then as you kind of see here, that relationship score correlates with people writing you checks. There's something that I just find once you feel really great, you all are together. It's like usually that's about the same time they're making an investment or something. That's just sort of how a good, organic, natural relationship with an investor is going to develop. And so I can leave you with one practical tip on fundraising is this: treat it as a connection process. And one of the benefits are you all have now is like there are investors you can have about Bitcoin, building a Bitcoin. Having that same kind of common purpose is a important point of connection. And again, this is a pointer that it wasn't always the case for us. We did support Ethereum for about a year. We dropped that in Q4 2019, again, before any of our investors were just Bitcoin only themselves. So it does take courage to kind of build out your values. And those are opportunities to further define and exemplify them for yourself and others. So our second value, we talked about celebrate extreme ownership. How many people here have read this book? Some familiar? highly recommend it. I mean, it's pretty short. It's also a very easy read. When I first read it, it was one of those like, yeah, this is obvious. This is so clearly how you have to behave. And it's Jaffa Willink and his co-authors basically talking about his experience in leading Navy SEAL teams and what was a good team, what was a high-performing team. It was most often a leader that set the example by taking responsibility for everything that went wrong. In the company, the equivalent basis is, well, we shipped a boat to production. Something happened and affected the client. You try to root cause or you talk about that and where did that problem come up? Well, it could have come up from the business person who asked for the change but didn't contemplate another thing that would affect, or the product person who didn't write a fully complete spec, or the engineer who didn't know that code case, or the QA person that didn't catch it. So there's always these ways anyone in that process could take some share of responsibility. And so one of the ways that we build into our culture as a team is we have a regular all hands meeting, started weekly, it's bi-weekly. And there's always a segment on there, as people unfortunately can attest, we call celebrating ownership. This is an extract from a recent all hands. We'll put the slide where we just spend 5 to 10 minutes. And to make sure it's not all negative, it's not all mistakes, sometimes it's shout outs. But it is often a case where, as you see here, there's the third one is that today I fucked up at Tfue. And there's always at least usually several Tfues on a company. There are going to be mistakes that happen. And it's an opportunity for me or the leaders in the company also to stand up and say, hey, this was a mistake. We botched this. Here's what we learned. Here's what we need to fix it. So it's one of the ways, companies pay lip service to like, oh yeah, it's okay to make mistakes. We have a culture that's tolerant that stuff. But I find unless you really build it into some practice or like ritualize this into your communications with the company and team, then that's not really a lived values. It's one way to really evidence it. And then when it really matters, this was, a tough moment, but one of those troughs for us at Unchained. When we were preparing this presentation, I realized, this is like the 3-year anniversary of this episode for us. So if you're not familiar, in 2022, Unchained, one of our marketing email providers, had a data leak. The story there was this was a firm we'd already moved on from, closed our account. We asked them to delete our data. In that time period in which they hadn't deleted our data yet, they were socially engineered and our mailing list was exfiltrated. So that was a really, really rough day. That sucked. It was like something to very, very seriously and felt very responsible for. In fact, one of the earlier drafts of this blog post, the title was just extreme ownership. We knew we had to cover this and talk to our community and clients about it. And so it's kind of one of those hard moments. And I'll get to the moment in 2 slides where it kind of does pay off over time, even when you have to take your lumps or go through an experience like this. But this is kind of that version of not only just living extreme ownership internally, but also externally to your customers and community around you. A last value, low time preference. This one's always been an interesting one. I find it's an evergreen one because you can always learn more of what low time preference is or means. For me, more fundamentally, it's about our relationships and making decisions with the long term in mind. I view it as like Bitcoin. It's been a small community. It's growing, but I always treat anyone on their way in and in fact on their way out that should be one of the best decisions for their career. That's anybody that leaves the company as much as possible. I'm keen to maintain the longest term perspective on that relationship. And so that's something that guides my behavior. It's also really important as a Bitcoin company that the stakes are high. You can't necessarily shortcut things in your product, and the consequences are people losing money, losing hard-earned savings, things like that. So having a low time preference is part parcel of how we develop products at Unchained. Goes in the decisioning process of what products to build. Are they there for the long term versus not? It's kind of an example in bringing back that celebrating that extreme ownership moment. This is kind of another one of those very down days that last November. People are maybe familiar with this or not. Nick Newman from Casa, another multi-sig provider, went public with a video in which there's one of these scammers that called him, and throughout the conversation, the scammer revealed that he had the Unchained database. So this happens in the morning. I start to get texts and calls from friends, investors, clients. Hey, what happened? Was Unchained hacked? Have you seen this? From other founders where I'm like, oh no, we weren't hacked. Like there's been no other leaks. Oh man, you should be taking to Twitter on this. Have you talked to your lawyer? You should be like going scorched earth. Like this war kind of a reaction to it. Again, that emotional cycle. And so, and I was so stunned. So I know Nick. I've talked to him. But we respect Costa. We consider them long-term operators as well in the space. Good values. So I called him. It's just when I think there's a lot of ways like people would just go to Twitter and like even incite flames and things like that. And I called him. I called him out. Hey man, we disclosed this 2 years ago. Here's the blog post. Here's everything that happened. Here's everything that was in that hat. Just clearly what this guy's referenced it. There's been no other data leak of, from Unchained. And to his credit, like he bought that. He understood that. Like we took responsible action at the time. There's nothing there for them to gain by continuing to kind of poke at or suggest that Unchained had some other bigger leak. And they agreed, to his credit as well, to not double down on that point, that from their own self-interest, it wasn't going to make them look any good because of the thing that Unchained already owned. So it's kind of, I think, again, an example or a way that celebrating ownership or that extreme ownership can serve you in the long run, even in the moments where it's like really hard. It can make sometimes those later shafters a little bit easier when you're confronted with challenges as well. So kind of bringing this back, or again, on the idea that sometimes those frontier values don't always, while they are important to remember and recognize, they don't always kind of get you all the way there. So you do have to integrate them with learnings along the way. So what we found with Unchained is those values were great to encapsulate early on, and they did serve us well, and they continue to. There was more needed, that just in the process of trying to grow up as a business, become profitable, become long-term successful, we had to add something to that. So what we found is just adding a corollary to kind of make it a more holistic state. So Bitcoin is our final purpose, and it's not our only purpose. We are a founder-led organization, first individuals, building a for-profit business with investor stakeholders. So it was kind of one of those traps sometimes to find ourselves in. It's like we're not purely just a Bitcoin community support organization. As much as we do that, we will continue to do that. Authentic and genuine interest, and continue to do that. We do have to maintain the idea we're a business. We want to be around for the long term, and so kind of making sure that help that value kind of be more clear and more holistically appropriate. This one was hard because it was like, okay, well, how is ownership never? How is that only? It's only good, right? How can extreme ownership ever be bad? And the kind of thing you watch as you grow is that people, which you're looking out first, the martyrs, the people who take on so much that they over encumber themselves, they start to burn themselves out. They're too busy saying yes to new things versus like questioning whether that is even something we should be doing. And so you have to take on some responsibility to also prioritize and delegate. That it's not just about just taking it all on as you can. And you should have to have that other idea in mind of let's take a step back, prioritize and delegate, and not just try to own it all. Low time preference and the ship with urgency. Like moments like that moment with Nick, and I wait a week to call him. I call that day. So sometimes it can feel like, that's again like low time preference for Bitcoiners is waiting long enough for the bodies of your enemies to float down the river. That just if I cut it in startups, there's a way that taking action every day, proceeding with urgency is part of building that same long-term success as well. So that's kind of good. I feel like, building startup is hard. Having some values are sort of what can create some level of certainty or some way to guide your actions. There's time. Happy to answer any questions, or you spent a few more minutes up here, but.
What would you do over again? What would you do over again for the younger version of you that you would through? Or what would I do over again? Or what did you love for just you now going back into your old body?
It's some way of relax. The point I'm sure you caught quite about that the connection over perfection thing was a massive transformer for me. It's and just changed the way I used to be hyper vigilant about notes. I would take all kinds of notes in meetings, and then over prepare for that follow up meeting. And that was a very fear driven kind of exercise for me, rather than trying to have a more like embodied knowing or like knowing. So that just through that journey, I found out my body will remember the important things if I just listen to it. It doesn't have to be a process of like go to my notes and be very left brain driven.
Question. Oh yeah. Do you think has materially changed about starting a startup now in the integration phase versus when you started like in the frontier stage, like with investors or you prioritize it?
I think it's because on the one hand, I think a problem is it's one of those Unchained gets to be something of like a more general focused company. It's financial services for Bitcoin. So help people, secure it, help people trade with it, get loans against it. And what you watch is now it's more specialized niches within each of those. Then those are also challenged by being a niche, not a very large user or client population. So like trying to find those actual large client populations, Unchained has had the very kind of generalist target market of long-term Bitcoin holders. So that's a great place for us to be focused because there is by now millions of them, and that's a growing market. So yeah, I think you are benefited by having more Bitcoin focused VCs. You are benefited by like having things like PlebLab that kind of help you get started. Trying to find like true breakout large target markets, I think it's always the startup challenge. So just how to get that done. That's tough. It's supposed to in front of you.
Hey, Joe, I have a question because I always struggle with this. Is there something that you look back and you're like, why did I waste my time doing that, or why I was so caught up with this one thing or the situation or whatever it could be? There's a million of those things, but like, was there one that you think back when you're like, really was it worth the trouble that had spent time and energy?
Yeah. Anything overly fear based, anything overly perfection seeking based, and the other, of course, like competitor focus or like having, a number of cycles where I'm like watching BlockFi do this, watching them raise this money, and it was like that. Oh my God, do we need to be like just those kinds of self challenges and questions when that's the point? It's like trying to stay the course, like know what your values are, what the principles are, know especially who your customer is. That is like the dawning moment for any companies truly knowing who its customer is, and then that try not to pay attention to anything else.
Can you expand on the perfection thing that you talked about? The perfection thing that you talked about?
Yeah, but yeah, I think it's just really a matter of like but we're all wired. We grew up as kids trying to please parents, or you have maybe standards or things like that, and so you should develop this mindset of I have to be perfect or I have to get something right. And usually it's someone else's voice in your head, or it is the voice of like that parent or that uncle or whoever that was like criticizing that thing. It's not actually like you. That's in there, and so I think that was just important to realize. And then what happens is I found trying to be perfect, it removes connection when especially when you're talking to an investor, because then they're something in your head. They're not talking to another human being about a thing. So it's just kind of like some of the from the art of and practice of relating. So, Polly.
Hey, John. Question about building. So, keyboard warriors are quite happy to be pretty vocal and negative online for projects. So, I just wondered, did you experience that early on in Unchained, and do you still experience that? Or people that have you said product,
or so you're the stressors of like people bash like Bitcoin Twitter being like very harsh grabs. Yeah. That's a good one. I think like, 'cause that's hard. I think that's that. There's a version of trying to be perfect that also looks like trying to be perfect for Bitcoin Twitter, which is like not, they're not always like your customers. They're not actually the real customers or actual customers for a thing. So knowing who the customer is can then maybe help you treat, any feedback like that more seriously. And I did, we have that tension there, at least at the company, when it comes to like how we take to social media, or what are our behaviors or approach there, because I don't, we want to be authentic. We want to hopefully not be criticized, but also don't want to run the business or run our comms based on how people are going to, how an imagined Bitcoin Twitter is kind of going to react. I think is at least part of the value of something like Bitcoin being your common purpose, is that like in general, we're usually taking actions. We're always aligned with like what, in general, people would agree are Bitcoin centric values. But you're just not always guaranteed how people would respond. So it's something to just develop thick skin about it. Getting back to the idea, like just knowing who's more important, customer, what.
So how can a business person or a brand build connection with groups who might hate Bitcoin but like your product, in the sense that they will get it for a max fee, or maybe segments that want to share that share the underlying values of Bitcoin, but are probably mistaken in their asset allocation.
So the question is sort of how to build connection with an audience that may be like fearful or not buying to Bitcoin, but there's otherwise a lot of adjacent interests. Yes. I mean, exciting challenge. I mean, I think you're onto something already insofar as you're realizing what are the adjacent values that are already there, and how do you build connection on those. Whereas usually people are resistant to Bitcoin. It's like there's the big antidote to that stuff, the kryptonite, is like genuine curiosity, like legit, like, oh, well, what is it that makes you so afraid of Bitcoin? Like actually take that in and try to understand it, and then you find some common ground from there. It's like their resistance that makes you resistant. Just those like compound. So you have to find ways from almost like a state of consciousness perspective of how to get in underneath those surface concerns.
I don't know. So with Unchained, do you feel you came up with that idea, or do you feel like Unchained found your cabbage?
It's a mix of both. I mean, definitely, I credit Drew with being something more of the early visionary Sherpa, and I was trying to make this thing make sense. He said that Bitcoin is going to change the world. Like, well, how does it become a business? And so that's one of the things about one of the benefits of having co-founder where you all are complementary is finding that alchemy of each of y'all's strengths and experiences. But that's part of what informs this talk is also by nature I'm more contemplative, and so trying to I do feel like Unchained has been something of a process of emergent discovery. What is a Bitcoin native financial services company that hasn't existed before? So I'm constantly mining out of what a traditional financial service would look like. What should we keep from there? What should we borrow or steal versus what to discard? And then what is a Bitcoin native institution you like? And then how do those kind of come together? So that's a lot of what informs just the background thinking on this. And then, that idea that I do feel like it's like it's a more discovery process necessarily than, well, there is some invention. It's mix of both. But I lean towards a little bit discovery just because I think if we didn't exist, somebody else would be building something like Unchained as Unchained does it.
Can we get time for one more question? Anybody has one?
All right, thank you, Joe. Ryan?